Hello students and welcome to the final chapters of Eco 102, that's macroeconomic policies. So specifically, we are going to be looking at two policies of the government. Those are fiscal policy and monetary policy. Now these two policies are covered into separate chapters in the book, but since this is the final chapter of the semester and this has been a long semester, let's say, I'm going to try and keep things very simple. I'm not going to go into too much details and just try to give you guys a basic idea of what a fiscal policy is and how it is implemented by the government, and then what a monetary policy is and how it is implemented by the government. And we're not going to go into too much details after that. Beyond this lecture, just video lectures, what I will encourage you all to do is to go through the books, go through the chapters in the books. So the book is Economics by Perkins, Powell, and Matthews. Hopefully you all have a copy of the book by now, either a hard copy or a soft copy. If you don't, ask me or your section instructor and we will provide a soft copy for you. Now, depending on which edition you're following, the chapter numbers will vary. If you are following the 9th edition, you should go through chapter 29 and 30. And if you are following the more latest edition, the 10th edition, you should go through chapter 30 and chapter 31. Okay. So first, we are going to be tackling fiscal policy, which is covered in chapter 29 in the 9th edition and chapter 30 in the 10th edition. So the first question, obviously, is what is fiscal policy? You guys may have heard this term before, either in an economics course, in the news, read about it in the newspaper or an article. Fiscal policy, monetary policy, these words get thrown around a lot. So basically, what is fiscal policy and why is it an important tool for government? So let me just write down the definition straight from the book. The book says that fiscal policy is government's use of its budget to achieve some macroeconomic objectives. So now that's the definition that's given in the book, but of course let's dig deeper into it and try to figure out what really this definition is trying to tell us. So first of all, is the government's use of its budget. So we are going to be talking about the government's budget in a bit more details, but for now, you all know what a budget is. Every year, the government has a budget, which is a list of its planned expenditures and incomes that they are going to be using. What does the government use its budget to? Well, the government has various economic objectives, not necessarily economic, other objectives as well, but we are focusing on economics right now. So what are some of the economic objectives that the government might have? So first of all, they may want low unemployment. We've covered unemployment already in the chapter. So you guys, in the course, so you guys know what low unemployment means and why it is desirable. The government may want price stability. By that, we do not want inflation to be too volatile. So once again, we've covered inflation in this course already. So you guys know already why price stability is desired and why the government will want to achieve it. Third of all, the government may want, what else might the government want? Economic growth. Once again, we've covered economic growth in this course before, and you all know why economic growth is desirable and why the government may want to achieve this. So these are the three things, three very basic things that the government might want to achieve. Now, the government wants to achieve, let's say, low unemployment. How do they? How does the government achieve low unemployment? Well, they effectively have two tools that they can use, as we've talked about. One is fiscal policy, one is monetary policy. And we're talking about fiscal policy right now. So if we take a look at the definition, once again, fiscal policy is the government's use of its budget to achieve macroeconomic objectives. So now let's talk about the government's budget in that case. What is the budget? How does the government raise money and how do they spend it? So of course, you all know, I mean, it doesn't just have to be government's budget. We all have budgets. I make a monthly budget. I expect to earn a certain amount of money. And from that, I plan to spend a certain amount of money. So for example, if I expect to earn 100 taka this month, and my plan is to spend 80 out of it, I will have 20 taka left at the end of the month. Now this is known as a budget surplus. When I'm spending less than the money that I'm bringing in. The opposite is also true. I make an income of 100, but I end up spending 120. And so at the end of the month, I have minus 20. Now, of course, the question is if I'm only earning 100, where is the extra 20 taka coming from? So maybe I've taken loan from a friend. Maybe I have savings in my bank and I've taken money out of there. There are different ways in which I can finance this additional expenditure. And we will talk about that as well. But for the time being, the focus is that our expenditure has been higher than our income. And this is known as a budget deficit. So just like this, these two examples where we have both income and expenditure, a government also have incomes and expenditures. So what they are called are receipts, the ways in which government raises money, and then there are outlays, which is the way in which the government plans to spend this money, the money that they have raised. So the next question is that how do the government raise money? What are the key ways in which it is done? And almost universally, I won't say exactly, but in almost all the countries in the world, the primary way in which the government raises its money is through taxation. There are many different types of taxation. You all know that there are income tax, for example. There are corporate taxes. There are even indirect taxes. For example, we pay VAT or sales duties. Then if we are engaging in foreign trade, with other countries, there is tariffs and other, so etc. So this is the primary way in which the government raises money. Now there are other ways as well in which government may be raising some money. So for example, when we pay for our electricity bill, when we pay for our gas, these are also receipts or incomes for the government, but these are very small percentage of the total money that's raised by the government. The next question is, these are the receipts. How do the government spend this money? So spending this money is, first of all, goods and services. The government buys goods and services for which they have to pay. There are interest payments. Most governments around the world have taken on a lot of loans and debts from both the citizens of the country and the rest of the world. and so they have to pay interests on these loans. That's another expenditure. Then there is also transfer payments. These are just direct transfers that the government makes to people. For example, because of the COVID lockdown, the government of Bangladesh has spent billions, actually trillions of taka, money that has gone to industries and poor people who are suffering. So these are all examples of transfer payments that the governments make. And at the end of the day, what we do is we take receipts, we subtract from that outlays, and that gives us the the budget balance, let's call it. And as we've already seen, is that if the receipts are higher than outlays, we have budget surplus. And if the outlays are higher than receipts, we have budget deficits. Now, of course, the book that we are using, the one I talked about, economics, there are two editions of this book, two versions actually, not edition, two versions of this book. One is the US version and one is the European version. So if you are using the US version, the examples are all about United States of America. And if you are using the European version, right, what you will see is a lot of examples from UK and the rest of the European Union. So, and feel free to go through those examples. But if I were to give an example from Bangladesh, in 2020, the budget that was announced included 5.68 taka trillion. So let me just write that down. 5.68 trillion taka in outlay. This is how much the government planned to spend during the year, the fiscal year of 2020 and 21. And there was 1.90 trillion taka in budget deficit. So effectively what this means is that during the year, government planned to spend 5.68 trillion taka. And at the end of the day, what the government projected is that they will overspend their receipts by 1.9 trillion taka. So now if from this information, if I were to ask you, what is the total income of the government or revenue? Actually, income is the wrong word in this case. What's the total revenue or receipt of the government? How should we calculate that? What we know is that revenue or receipt minus the outlay or expenditure gives us the budget balance. I'm writing it in short. So what do we know? We do not know the receipt, but we know that there is an outlay of 5.68 trillion, and that would give us a budget deficit of 1.9 trillion. Now here's the important thing. This is a deficit. Since it's a deficit, we put a minus here because we know that this is higher than this. So if we just do the calculation, so revenue will be equal to 5.68 trillion minus 1.90 trillion, which gives us how much? 3.78 trillion. Right, so what we know is that when the budget was made in 2020, the government expected that they would raise a total of 3.78 trillion taka. They would end up spending 5.68 trillion taka. So at the end of the day, there will be a budget deficit of 1.9 trillion. This is the case for Bangladesh. If you go online, you can very easily find the same information for any country in the world. These are publicly announced by all the governments. And second of all, of course, if you go to the books, you can look at the case for US or some European Union countries. So feel free to do either one. But it's better if you don't just stick to this one example. Look at a few examples and get a feel for how these things are usually done. In fact, I'm going to share a diagram from the book. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Okay, so this is for the United States of America for the year 2011. But as I said, if you search online, you can find the latest figures from 2020. 2021 has not been announced yet. It will be announced in a few years. But up to 2020, this is very easily available. So this shows us the budget scenario of the US government from the year 1980 to 2015. 2011. Now, what we see here is that this blue area, this is how much money the government raised, their revenue. And the red area on top is showing us by how much in that specific year the outlay exceeded receipts. So for example, if we look at 2010, if we go up, so this is how much the revenue for the government was in that year. And if we keep going up, this is how much the expenditure was. And so the red area, this area, this shows us that the budget deficit of each year. And if you look very carefully, you see that there was this one year in 2001, if I'm not mistaken, 1 year when the US government had budget surplus, which means that their revenue was higher than their expenditure. Otherwise, the government tends to operate on a deficit. Now, if we come to this diagram here, this shows us the breakdown of the receipts and outlays. So as I said, let's come up here. As I said here, is that receipts are mostly tax. It's not only tax, but it's mostly tax. And we can see that in the case for US, out of the revenues that the government had made, it includes indirect tax, social security tax, corporate income tax, and personal income tax. There are other revenues, receipts as well, but these are relatively small, so they're not included here. And if you look at the outlays, you see the expenditure on goods and services, debt interests, and transfer payments. So this is the case for US. As I said, you guys can find a similar thing for any other country in the world. Okay, so let us go back to the definition just to make sure that we really understand what fiscal policy is. What we have seen so far is that the government has receipts, they have outlays, and to a large degree, the government can decide how much this will be. The government can increase the rate of tax in trying to increase their receipts, or they can reduce taxation. The government can increase their expenditure or decrease their expenditure. And by doing these things, the government has some control over effectively what their budget balance will be. By doing these things, of course, you can see that they are affecting the economy. When they increase the tax rate, it's going to have an effect on the economy. When they start spending more money, suppose the government starts to build more roads, build more highways and buildings, that's going to have an effect on the economy. Or suppose the government decides to lower the cost of gas that we use in our houses, or lower the cost or increase the cost of electricity, that's going to have an effect on the economy, on people, on companies. And so what fiscal policy is that it takes a look at how the government uses or manipulates its budget, or to break it down even further, how the government manipulates its receipts and outlays to achieve certain macroeconomic objectives. Okay, so to give a very simple example, suppose the government notices that there isn't enough economic activity, growth is low. So what they decide to do is the lower tax. When the lower tax, people have more money. When they have more money, they start to spend more money. Demand goes up. When demand goes up, maybe supply also goes up. And so we have caused economic growth. Now that's of course a very simple example. We are going to be going through a bit more complex examples in the next video. But before you move on to the next video, at the end of this video, make sure that you understand what fiscal policy is properly. Okay, so I think that is it for introduction to fiscal policy. In the next video, we are going to go into a bit more complex examples and analyze the scenario a little bit more.